Okay, in today's video, I want to talk a little bit about risk management. So, risk management, kind of in general, but also specifically for internal audit. Now, last week I put a poll out on LinkedIn, and it was a very simple question that said, is there more risk in the auto industry or in the pharma industry? And just asked people to, mark which one they felt had more risk. Okay. Now, I wasn't surprised with the results, and I'm going to get into that in just a minute. And it might seem like a very simple question, but it's actually a good question for being able to understand some of the misunderstanding and even some misinformation that internal auditors get about risk. Now, I used to be a chief risk officer as well as being in charge of internal audit. So I've kind of seen both sides, right? The risk management side and the internal audit side. And what I can tell you is that a lot of people in internal audit do not understand risk the way risk managers understand it. Okay. And so you can stop at that point and say, well, I know this is the opinion of a lot of internal auditors where they will say, well, risk management just doesn't understand risk. We're the experts in risk. We understand risk. Really? Maybe you should take a look at and dig in a little deeper because, again, what I found in my experience is that internal audit has a very narrow view of risk. And as a result, they don't talk about it the same way that everybody else who does risk. And so this question kind of helps to highlight some of those things so that you can start asking yourself some better questions about risk. You can understand risk better, and you can start using some of these critical thinking skills. Now, I know a lot of you that are probably listening to this who are auditors are thinking, well, I have great critical thinking skills. What are you talking about, Jason? Well, I know that the profession prides itself on having these good critical thinking skills, professional skepticism and other things like that. And you may believe that, and that's just fine. What I am finding is from talking to lots of chief audit executives and people in the industry, the number one skill gap in internal audit is critical thinking skills. So whether you believe it or not doesn't really matter. But the people who are hiring you, the people that are in charge of internal audit, they think on average that people need to improve their critical thinking skills. And so in this video, where I'm going to go through and talk a little bit and kind of share more information about that question that I was talking about, but also how you can start using and thinking a little differently so that you're asking better questions and you're not just accepting things because somebody told you that. Now, this is a trend, that we're seeing across all of society, where most people just, go out to Google, they type in a search, they ask a question, they look at one or two of the websites that pop up and decide that's the answer. And a lot of times that isn't the answer. That isn't the real answer. That's somebody's opinion that is not based in fact. So let's talk about this question that I had. And again, I'm recording this live. So if you're on with me, if you want to comment and I can see those comments coming through, we can have a little discussion around this as I'm recording it too. So the question was, is the auto industry or the pharma industry, which one of those is higher risk? Okay. Now it's kind of a trick question, and it's a trick question on purpose because sometimes I do that, right? Now, the reason that I picked this as a question is a few years ago, somebody reached out to me and sent me a message because they were studying for the CIA exam and they couldn't understand why a particular answer was considered correct on the exam. Okay. And the question, again, it's not word for word, but something to the effect of the question that I just asked. right? Which of the industries has higher risk? And the theoretical answer was the pharmaceutical industry. Okay, that was the correct answer according to the IIA on the test. And so the person asked me, they said, I don't understand why they say this is the right answer. Can you explain it to me? And so we talked about it. I can't remember if we talked on the phone or if we were exchanging messages, but kind of went back and forth. And I said, I don't understand why they're making that assumption that that is the correct answer. Okay, because there's a lot of things that they were not thinking about in making that particular decision. Now, some people may say, oh, well, in general, pharmaceutical is more risky because people are taking things and putting it in their body and they could die. Well, under that logic, every time you get behind the wheel of an automobile, you could die, right? And so, even though you're not ingesting the automobile, a lot of people die in automobile accidents. And in fact, if we put some data behind this, right, there's three top killers kind of in the US as far as accidental death. Okay. And they're not the things that people are thinking about or that people are concerned with. And it's automobile accidents, alcohol, and smoking. And, alcohol and automobiles mixed together, that's a deadly combination, right? And so the reality is, automobiles pose a much greater risk to death of humans than pharmaceuticals do necessarily. Okay, so there's a little bit of data point there, but again, we're not just going to rely on that because I'm talking to you about critical thinking skills as well, right? But a lot of people, and this is where the critical thinking skills end up falling down, is people make generalizations and believe that they have all the facts when they're actually making a decision, right? So somebody might look at it and say, oh, well, pharmaceutical is more risky because, people are putting things in their body and it could kill them. So I'm just going to make a generalization that one's more risky. Or somebody on the flip side could say, well, Jason, you just told us that automobiles kill more people than, most anything else in America. And so you could, again, make a generalization at that point and say, well, automobile industry must be more risky because of that. Okay. And again, some people would stop there, but that would not be using your critical thinking skills. It would not be actually using, good risk management skills either. And interesting, I told you that critical thinking skills are probably the biggest skills gap that chief audit executives are seeing. Another big one, risk-based internal audit and risk management. That again, people don't understand these concepts as well as they think they do. Okay, so let's go through and talk about this a little bit more and try to apply some more critical thinking skills. So first thing, when you get a question like that, and again, I put a post out on LinkedIn that was a poll asking people which one do they think is more risky. And, again, I haven't checked this morning, but at least as of yesterday, about 75% of people said pharma was riskier than auto, right? So about 25% said auto. Interesting, again, but not a surprise, like I said, based on the IIA teaching that as part of the CIA exam, even though it's not necessarily the right answer. Okay. And so when you get asked a question like that, right, you need to understand the context more. And in fact, when I put the poll out there, only one person out of thousands and thousands of people that saw it or that commented and voted on the poll even asked any qualifying questions. Okay. And so again, that shows me something is that, if you're not asking some qualifying questions to understand the context better, then you're probably making a generalization and maybe making a decision that didn't actually use critical thinking skills. So, one of the first things that you want to do is when people are asking questions like that, to start asking some qualifying questions. So, again, if I ask you which one is more risky, the auto industry or the pharma industry? Well, a qualifying question that you could ask me is something like, well, do you mean inherent risk or residual risk? Okay, because those are two different levels of risk for you to consider, and depending on, again, what it is, what your purpose is, would determine whether or not you're concerned with inherent risk or if you're concerned with the residual risk. Now, many of you may not even know that there's a difference between inherent and residual risk. If that's the case, then that's maybe an area that you should go research a little bit more to know what's the difference between inherent and residual risk. Okay, that's a qualifying question, because again, if you were to pose that question, right, then if you're looking at it, say, based on inherent risk, some people may still say pharma, some people may say auto. Now, I'll talk about kind of why. If you're looking at residuals, some people may again say one or the other, but at least now they've got more information. They're digging in a little bit more as to what we're talking about. Now, another clarifying question could be something like, well, which risk are you talking about? Right? Because again, risk is a broad term, but there are different aspects or different kinds of risk. Am I talking about reputation risk? Am I talking about operational risk? Am I talking about financial risk? Right? And even under financial, it's broken out into things like currency risk, interest rate, risk are just a couple of the differences there, right? And so again, you have to start looking at or thinking about, well, risk is a very broad term. Are you referring to a particular risk, right? And so again, maybe if we look at something like reputation risk, and that's what we're concerned with, then some people might say, well, pharmaceutical maybe has a higher reputation risk, because if something goes wrong with one of their drugs, right, that can have a huge reputation risk on the organization. Okay, because there's a brand, that goes behind their particular drug. And so, again, maybe it's that, right? Because when certain companies have issues, I think, was it Moderna, or no, I can't remember the name of it. There was one of the pharma companies who was overcharging for I think EpiPens or something like that. Ended up going to jail. There was some fraud and other things that were going on in that instance. And so there, again, reputation risk was a big deal for pharma, and many could argue maybe a bigger deal in that industry than it is in the auto industry. Okay. Also, you could look at it and say, we went through a whole pandemic and vaccines and the pushing and the pricing of the drugs and all the marketing that's done. And so some people might say, well, look, from a reputation risk standpoint, maybe a lot of people are tired of big pharma. I've just given people pills. And so again, maybe they decide that from a reputation risk, right, that maybe there is more risk in that industry. Okay. So, starting to ask some clarifying questions and actually thinking it through will help you come to some better answers. Okay. Now, as I thought about this, if I had to make just a snap decision on which one is riskier, my vote would be for the auto industry. Now, a lot of you might say, well, why? I don't understand that. Cars versus drugs. Drugs are much riskier than cars are. So let me kind of explain some logic, right, that I kind of went through as I was thinking about that question as to why my vote might tip that way. Okay. So if we look at how each of those industries are done, Okay. And we look at, for example, drugs versus cars. Okay. Most of the pharmaceutical operational process is controlled by the pharmaceutical company. Okay. They develop a drug, they spend time and money in research and development. They find something that they think is a good or meets some demand or cures some illness. They go through a whole bunch of clinical trials where they're actually trying this out on people, animals, other things like that. Then once they kind of determine that they've got some good studies, then they have to go to the government, at least here in the US, to get approval to sell the drug, and on and on and on and on. They usually control the manufacturing process. And so again, maybe there's many different things that go in it, but I'm just going to pick a number, right? Maybe there's 5 different ingredients or 10 or 20 ingredients that go into a particular drug, okay? And so that's a very small number of ingredients that go in to making the drug, okay? If you converse that to the auto industry, an automobile is made up of thousands of different parts, right? Thousands of different parts that are usually manufactured by lots of different companies on behalf of the automobile company. And so I remember there was a meme on social media at some point where it had a picture of a Ford Mustang and it had a picture of a Toyota Camry. And the question was, which one is a quote unquote American car? Okay. And what's interesting, again, snap decision that most of us, would make on what seems to be a simple question. A lot of people would say, well, the Ford is because Ford is an American car company and Toyota is a Japanese company. Okay. That's one way of looking at it. But if you look at where the parts are manufactured and where those vehicles were assembled, you would find, I want to say that maybe 80% of the parts in the Mustang were actually made outside of the US, and it was actually assembled in Mexico. So is the Mustang really an American car? Versus fewer of the parts in the Toyota Camry were made outside of the US, and the Camry was actually assembled in the United States. Okay, so again, we're asking more questions to try to understand and come to a conclusion. But based on some of those facts, it's easy to argue that the Toyota Camry is more of an American car than the Ford Mustang is. Okay, now you can also look at ownership of the companies, right? Who owns Ford Motor Company? Well, it's a publicly traded company, right? And so I believe Toyota is as well. But you could look at things like, well, who actually owns those companies, right? And if a majority of people who own Ford Motor Company live outside of the U.S. or are not U.S. citizens, then again, maybe you decide, well, maybe Ford isn't a US based company, even though that's where they're legally structured, but if they're owned by other people. Okay, so do you see how we're starting to kind of go through some of this thought process? Okay, and so again, back to the auto industry and why I would vote for auto over pharma in general is, as I said, you have a lot of different parts, maybe thousands of parts that make up an automobile, maybe versus 5 or 20 in a pharmaceutical, which means operationally, there are a lot more parts in that car that can go wrong. And if some of those parts go wrong, it could lead to death or the car not working, right? And the fact that most of the car companies don't actually control the manufacturing supply chain, that increases more of the operational risk, right? Because if one of your partners who makes parts for a particular car, if something happens to them, you have a lot of supply chain risk at that point, especially since a lot of car companies follow more just in time kind of manufacturing, which means If one part doesn't show up, you have to shut down the whole production line, right? So operationally, there's a lot more to deal with from a supply chain standpoint in the automobile industry. Now, there's also a lot more competition in the automobile industry than there is in pharmaceutical. And again, some of you might say, well, no, there's a lot of pharmaceutical companies. Yes, but there's a lot of really big pharmaceutical companies that are usually very well protected because of intellectual property and legal and patents and trademarks and other things like that than are in the car industry. And so, as an example, some of the changes around electronic vehicles, electric cars, we have seen in the last 10 years. Look at all of the new entrants into the automobile industry. In fact, a car company named Tesla, that wasn't even around 20 years ago, has become a very large player in the automobile industry. In fact, again, I don't know where the facts are exactly, so you could go fact check as you're doing your critical thinking around this. But if I remember, Tesla has a much higher market cap than Ford Motor Company. Even though Ford has been around for a long time, the market values Tesla a lot more than they do Ford. Okay. So again, these are just some different things for you to start, thinking through, asking questions about, to really start digging into, what really are the risks. Because what I'll tell you is most of the time, when it seems like a simple answer, it's usually not a simple answer if you sit down and start thinking about it. And that's again where these critical thinking skills come in, where you can start asking better questions so you can get more context, right, around it. And you can make a better answer. You can start looking for data that supports one position over the other. You can look at it from multiple angles. And again, as you start to define it more about the type of risk, whether it's inherent or residual, maybe what objective, you're looking at, all of those things will start to give you a better idea of what the answer is. Now, I'm going to give you another example of how sometimes questions that are asked seem so simple, and most people want a yes or no answer, when yes or no, neither one of those is the right answer until you understand and get better context. And so I remember a story about Albert Einstein, right? The physicist, theory of relativity, where someone came to him and said, Dr. Einstein, do you believe in God? Do you believe in God? Now, that should be a simple yes or no question, right? When somebody asks a question like that, they are looking for a yes or no. But a yes or no answer to that question is very generalized, and neither one of those answers is probably going to be correct. And so what hit me was when Einstein was asked that question, he asked a clarifying question. He said, "Explain to me what you mean by God, and then I can answer your question." Right? So again, if somebody comes forward and throws out a term like God or throws out a term like risk, well, you need some clarifying questions to understand, what do you actually mean by God? What do you actually mean by risk if I'm going to answer that question? Okay. And so again, what's the answer to the question? Well, there is no right or wrong question, because again, depending on the context, depending on what you're looking for in particular, either one of those may be considered higher risk over the other. But again, the purpose of this is not to tell you specifically what the right answer is. I told you what I would say and why I would argue that in a general question like that, I would think auto is actually a higher risk overall than pharmaceutical. But again, you can decide and you can make your own decision, right? And as you dig in, as you get more information, as you have better context, as you have some data to go along with it, then you can actually start to answer the question after you have thought about it critically. And so, again, as I said kind of at the beginning of the video, the purpose for this was just to help you understand that, if what I'm saying to you is like completely new and you're like, holy smokes, I've never heard this before. Well, maybe there's an opportunity here for you to learn a little bit more, to improve your risk management skills, to improve your risk management knowledge and understanding, and to start asking more questions so that you can start thinking more critically. And again, why? Because these are two of the skills that chief audit executives are looking for, either in their own staff or in the people that they're hiring. And they're telling me that they're not finding a lot of people with good skills in either place. So, if you're interested in improving your career, these are two areas where you probably want to learn a little bit more information. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off for today, and I'll see you on the next live video.